Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, an online role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another Roll20 review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the marketplace section of online role-playing website Roll20.net. For this video, we'll be taking a look at the third adventure path module for the War for the Crown Pathfinder campaign titled The Twilight Child. Twilight Child is designed for a party of 7th level heroes who should have completed the previous two modules of the campaign, and they'll be reaching 10th level by the end, making it a solid Tier 2 adventure. Let's switch over and check it out. So the Twilight Child provides a bounty of interesting side quests within the mercantile city of Yanmas, and more importantly for Roll20 module, plenty of quality maps to support them. I am so pleased at the amount of maps in this module, specifically because especially the last one, the Songbird, Sign, and Saboteur module, was very lacking in the map department, so that is much more improved here. But first, let's see what we get in the Twilight Child package, which, as it was the case with the last one, literally adds into the existing module that you already have, so that way you can seamlessly transfer all of your existing characters into the module. And in fact, the way it's set up now, as you can see here, is actually included above. So before they were adding all of the modules separately for my review purposes, but now I have one War for the Campaign module. Campaign, I don't know what to call them, adventure paths, campaigns, modules, it's all getting a little confusing, but in any case, all of them are being added into the one module. So you can see here there's part 1, part 2, and you can see it's that FCC, and then part 3 over here. So it makes this a lot bigger than what it seems, but just know that this is all three of them combined, and obviously I haven't gone through and like archived all the older ones yet. And the nice thing is on the journal on the right side, also you can see here every single thing to do with each individual module is contained within a giant subfolder, so you can literally just collapse these or expand them as you need it, so that way I can just skip and go straight to the third one right here, which is also nice to have and very well organized. So I'm glad I got to see how that works. So with the Twilight Child specifically, you get 11 5-foot battle maps, all with the dynamic lighting for Roll20 subscribers. That is amazing. We're going to go through those in a moment. You get one non-gridded overland map, which is the city of Yanmas, which is where the entirety of this module takes place. 52 unique named NPC character sheets with matching tokens and GM descriptions, 25 of which have pics and player handouts. 42 generic NPC monster sheets with draggable tokens, vision, and separate player handouts. 53 magic item player handouts, only 11 with pictures. A lot of them are potions and generic wands. You do have the token page, which is pretty much standard for all their marketplace modules at this point. As I mentioned, it's available as an add-on to the existing War for the Crown adventure, which really should be used that way because it's the only way any of the story should make sense. The journal is organized into 4 parts, unlike the previous 2, which had 3 parts, really a 3-act structure. Each of these containing DM notes, maps, and the player handouts that you will need. There are detailed notes on the locations and history of the city of Yanmas, again being the central location that you'll be dealing with. There are extra notes and supplemental rules and things on death and resurrection, as well as psychopomp creatures, which is a thing that you'll have to deal with toward the end of this adventure, as well as rollable tables for optional random encounters and rumors around Yanmas. So pretty standard stuff compared to all their previous modules, particularly with the previous Pathfinder modules. The big takeaway here is a huge number of maps is amazing. So let's start in order. And this one is actually a bit more non-linear compared to the other ones. The other so the last adventure you had a big open world section, but it was still like, here's part 1, which is a very specific event. Part 2 is your open world section where you can go off and do around things around that county of Marat. And then part 3 you came back and did this linear event. This one, the whole thing is kind of open, like all 4 parts. You do start with part 1, which is essentially it picks up at the end of the previous module, where you just get your new assignments, like, well, you need to go, now that you've established yourselves in the country, now you need to go to the city, which is run by a bunch of merchant lords and ladies, and help win over the nobles and the people to the cause of Princess Eutropia, because you're working for the the right of succession, basically, in order to put her in charge instead of whatever the asshole, I can't remember. There's some warring noble who's trying to create a big civil war in Taldor. You don't want that to happen. So part 1 essentially begins with you meeting with all of this. It's called the Mercantile Council, which reminds me very similarly to the Merchant Princes of Port Nyanzaru from the Tomb of Annihilation campaign for D&D 5th edition. It's essentially the same thing. It's just run by a bunch of merchants and kind of CEOs and mafia bosses who run everything. Let's take a look at Jan Moss real quick. Go to that map. Here we go. There's the city of Jan Moss. There's also a nice handout somewhere. Although, let's see. I think it might be further down. Player handouts. There we go. I just wanted to see this art because that's really nice art. I love Pathfinder's art. I think they do some really great stuff here, and the handouts are always really well done. I kind of don't like the handouts quite as much as the last adventure for whatever reason. They're not quite as compelling, but this one is really nice. So yeah, they arrive in Jan Moss, and they meet, part 1, they meet with the council, and it basically is set up very similarly to like a video game RPG, where you go to this like central hub and you get a whole bunch of side quests, main quests, plot threads. You know, you get to talk to all the major NPCs there, including the primary antagonist, the Earl. Oh, I can't remember his name. Earl's like Marcondius, something like that. There's a lot of names to keep up with here. I'm not going to be able to find him that easily. There he is. Earl Yender Mercondis. Good lord. Got it. This guy is a dick, and he is essentially undermining what are they called? The Loyalists, who are for Princess Eutropia, and he is doing everything he can to sow discontent and raise the civil war, and he's done essentially 2 main things. He paid off the Taldarin cavalry to betray their country and essentially work for him and the whatever his master is, whom you met during the first Crownfall adventure, which you'll have to deal with them. And he also hired or summoned, I don't know exactly how it works, a bunch of demons to just sow discontent, and specifically in the Loyalist faction, and they do so by inducing like these horrible nightmares with people. And so you have to deal with these 2 separate main quest plot threads, but you get there kind of organically through doing a bunch of these rumors and side quests and issues by meeting with the meeting with that council. And it'll be like let's see if I can prop that up. Where are we at? We're at part 1, the Mercantile Council. Thank you. And you can see these are pretty big, lots of text here. You can see there's the different people, largest spice importer, clothing importer. Just these are all the CEOs and bosses of the city that just run everything. And it's like this guy blames this new restaurant that opened, so maybe you should go investigate that. This woman says there's a rumor of someone hiding out in the local public parks. You could go investigate that. So there's the chief holy man, the high priest of the Church of Abadar in Yanma says, hey, there's this new cult that's, it's a cult. Cults are bad. That we should go investigate and come meet with me at my church, and I'll tell you about it. So you get all these various threads, which I love, and it still remains in part 1. Essentially, once they have this meeting, which for once doesn't end in bloodshed, and it isn't a very long social encounter, unlike how the first 2 modules started, which were very long, extended sequences of multiple things happening. This is just, hey, these people say their thing, you get to talk to each one, and then you step out of the city, and there's the world, the city map, and you get to decide which threads you want to follow up on and what order you want to do. That's really cool, and I like the way, that's how I like doing open world stuff in an RPG, because that gives you, the DM, at least some structure and a framework on what all you need to prepare. You can say like, okay, instead of just saying, what do you want to do, say, okay, here are 4 things you can do. And now you as the players get to decide which ones you want to do in what order and which threads you want to follow. And me as the DM, I can say, here are your options, and I have prepped all these things to a decent enough degree. And so I like that balance a lot. That's better than just having this a complete open world section, but you still feel like you give your players those kind of options and things. So I really like how Part 1 is organized. And Part 1 has a lot going on. As I said, all of these locations, how many are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm not including this last one because that's the Zon Strikes is actually the finale at the end. So there's 7 locations in Part 1. Or no, Confronting Morcundus is actually also at the end. So 6. I was right, so half a dozen. 6 locations they can basically follow up on in order to figure out what's going on. And one of them is literally just, and I'm going to show you these maps. One of them is just like you meet some townsfolk that are acting funny, and it turns out they're kind of fucked up from these nightmares they've been given from these shape-shifting demons. What is that? Charmed Townsfolk map. And you can see this is a really simple, super simple, bare bones map of a town, and it's wonderful. I love it. This is exactly the kind of stuff I want when I purchase a Roll20 module. Is I want these maps. I don't want to have the work of like I'm reading, okay, the party is going to have this kind of encounter, because I'm thinking like, okay, that's great, but now I got to put that map in there, I got to put the tokens in there, I got to do all that work for that encounter. And I don't have to do that here, which is great. And not only that, but this is a pretty solid map. I could reuse this map for other city random encounters, because it says there's a whole list of random encounters the party can combat encounters the party can have when they're going around doing all these investigations in the city, and you can reuse this map, which is fantastic. So I love that there's even really simple maps like that here, which is great. You can see here the way it truncates the names of some of these. You end up with the enumerator's ass for one of these maps, and that is always worth a good giggle. I think that's fantastic. And of course these assassins. So when you go and meet with the chief, the high priest, there's a pair of assassins that actually have come to kill him. So you have to fight them off, and that leads you further to down another plot thread, which is nice. But look, I mean, it's another really teeny tiny map. There's not much going on. It's just a single combat encounter, and almost all of these are basically like that. This is a kind of a diviner witch lady you can go meet, which this is a really cool plot hook, because you go to visit her, and it turns out the lady who's here is the lady that killed her, and she's just staying in her house. And she's fucked up from the nightmare visions, and she ended up killing. It's really cool. So your players have to like suss out like, oh shit, and they find the body in the trunk and all that. That's great shit. But look, it's a teeny tiny map with just a single encounter, and they're pretty much all like that. Savory's is a little bigger. It's a restaurant. Not much bigger. This guy's like an illusionist. He's really kind of not really an evil guy, but you end up. I think you get the plot thread to leads you to the butcher house, which is a fucking den of evil. And then one of my favorites, the head shield isn't much. There's just a woman there that's from the cavalry that got paid off, and she was one of the good ones that got betrayed, and she was sent to essentially a suicide mission, was to go visit this decrepit manor, which has a bunch of petrified statues everywhere, and every player with their salt knows when you see a bunch of humanoid statues around, there's a fucking Medusa somewhere. And that is definitely the case here, but it's really cool. She's basically staging this scene from like her favorite play, so she's got all these macabre, it's like this bloody wedding that happened, and all the players are in place, and she's trying to like form them, and she's kind of demented as Medusa typically are. So that's a really neat scenario there. So these are all really cool, and I just love that there's maps for all these locations, which is absolutely fantastic. So each of these little events, they essentially draw you into 3 plot threads, which make up the story of the Twilight Child. And that is the hired demons that the Earl hired or summoned. I forget what exactly they did, those shape-shifting demons, which I'll show you that. That's part 2. Part 3 is the paid-off cavalry that have betrayed their oaths or whatever to essentially act as bandits that are terrorizing the city. That's part 3. And then the last one is this Sinister Cult that claims to have resurrected the true heir to the throne, Princess Eutropia's slain younger brother from like 2 decades ago. who was like killed by his abusive father, who was an asshole. That's part 4, right? 2, 3, yeah, that's part 4. So you can see you could go 1, 2, 3, 4, but your players could also just take one of these threads and continue following it along to where they end up from, like the Savory's restaurant to the butcher house. So they only did like one thing in part 1 and then went directly to part 2. And that's fine. You just have to know that it's not organized like an actual 3-act structure here. This is actually just organizing it basically by location, in the fact that those other plot threads are the conclusion of those plot threads, and they all represent slightly different, slightly bigger, more in-depth locations. So we'll go into those, but I really love the way part 1 is designed. I love just everything about, like, that gives you the freedom. It's got the maps all in place. They're all just kind of mini little adventures. That's really good stuff. So part 2 is the demons, and they have to investigate this butcher house, and this is a fucking cool map. Look at how messed up this map looks. This is a really dark, macabre, grisly sight. I want to zoom out. There we go. The blood everywhere. Just visually, that's awesome. It's got the outline of the trap, which is important to note, because this trap they walk around with, it's set up like an attacking creature. Like, it has a plus attack, and these like saws and shit just come out. Like, they basically just created this death creature out of metal and wood and machines. But there's these 4 shape-changing demons called Peraka, which for the longest time, my brain was just reading it as paprika, but they're definitely not a seasoning. They are demon people, like sex cannibal demons, like sadomasochist, like messed up shit. So they do the nightmare-inducing thing on a bunch of people. Like, that's an ability they have, and you literally have nightmares about, like, being with a lover or a loved one and then, like, tearing flesh off or having your flesh torn off in this kind of grisly, erotic but, like, terrifying manner. It's that kind of mixture, that sadomasochist thing, and it's very unsettling. And there's actually a note in here. I don't know if I can pull it up and I could find it, but that's like, that cautions you about this kind of material, and it's just like, hey, just, like, make sure your players are on board with this, particularly if you're gonna actually inflict one of these nightmares on a player. Like, it could go off pretty cool if everybody's into that kind of horror scene, especially like body horror, torture stuff. But make sure your players are even comfortable having this as a subject matter, in terms of how much detail you want to go into it, and then B, if you want to even involve a player, and make sure they are going to be okay with that. Just I'm not going to tell you to run your game or anything. Just know your players. That's really the basis of every successful D&D campaign, or Pathfinder campaign in this case. But I like the way this dungeon is designed. There's only 4 of the demons. It's not a super packed dungeon, but they are very powerful. They're like all about illusions. They are shape changers, as I mentioned. That's part of what they do. You get these cool rumors about these messed up like rams and cats with like black eyes, and that's all people can say. It's like, oh, I keep seeing this animal and I get nightmares. Well, it's these demons that can do it, and you can see they are multi-sided tokens, and they have a lot of sides because they can turn into a lot of different animals, including just regular people. So, and Roll20 does it as a multi-sided token, which gives you a ton of cool options, which is really nice. But yeah, there's like a giant demon dog thing called an obdog, which reminds me of the description reminded me of literally that like necromancer dog from Monster Hunter, which I think was also called Aldebaran. Lots of cool creatures. There's a swarm of rotten grubs for just, it's nasty shit in here. Just a long abandoned butcher house taken over by sadomasochist demons. It's not going to be pleasant. But pretty straightforward. And you get to the end of it, and you basically find correspondence that led you to believe that it implicates the Earl as having hired them. Now, somehow you would have to tell your players that they need 2 damning, corroborating pieces of evidence to actually like confront the Earl, and that's something that I would. So what I do is I use like a custom quest system for Roll20, and that is I just create a subfolder with handouts, and those handouts literally just say the quest as the title, like literally like a video game RPG journal. Like it'd be like quests as the title, and then like who gave you the quest, where does the quest go, maybe quest rewards if I even want to get kind of like World of Warcrafty about it, like what are the what did the NPC offer you, and then like notes that me or the players can add as they discover information. This is a great module to utilize that because there's a lot of multiple threads you have to juggle, a lot of different quests going on at the same time, and particularly like notes and information they get. And something I would just tell them is like, hey, you need to get 2 pieces of evidence before you can confront the Earl. If you want to, I mean, otherwise they could try and do it, but that's the campaign tells you like they need to complete basically parts 2 and part 3 before they can actually go after the main villain and say, hey, you were actually responsible for all this shit going down. So part 2 is at 1 thread. Part 3 is you following the thread of the paid-off cavalry, which you end up going to the outskirts of town, as we'll scroll over to Tall Grasses here. And this is pretty much just a straightforward assault on a giant fortress. You can see these maps are not very large physically, but this one is fucking stacked. It is brimmed full of NPCs, tokens, creatures, mostly just people. And you have to make your way through it. You can see there's a giant like elephant out in front. These guys have essentially been paid off by the Earl. They've turned traitor. They're working with these local grass creatures, which are these 4-armed plant creatures here. And you have to fight this elephant out in front that's kind of irritated. The horses are actually kept, you can see in that dynamic lighting here, hidden because they're trying to fake out that they are not who they are, which is these cavalry has betrayed their country, and they dress up like bandits from another country and even have to have different horses and all this. But this is pretty much just a straightforward dungeon crawl. You're going room to room. There's a bunch of bad guys to beat up. There's not really a whole lot of social situations to be found here. The one cool thing I liked about this area is that one of the characters here is the brother to the commander, Jalessa. So there's some cool like familial tiles there about why he would be supporting her. But he's got a wife who's not here, but she finds out that he dies, assuming, you know, you go through violently, which it seems like you probably should, actually, because they're all pretty much hostile. And she's down here on the hidden layer, and she rides like a winged drake and has like a little mini force with her, and she hunts down the players later as revenge, which is really neat. I like that. So the players just get ambushed by this like miniature army of what they went through this dungeon and just fought, and it's supposed to be, just a cool like follow-up to these events, which I really like that. And it can even happen like way after, even as far back as they hightail it back to the city or somewhere else. So they're on this map just so they're here, but they could, it actually says they probably won't, she won't even actually probably make it to them unless they end up like long resting here, which if I know players often just long rest amidst the bodies of their defeated foe, so they could certainly end up fighting here. But otherwise, it's, you know, it's a well done map. Certainly there's nice little details everywhere, but it's not the most exciting design, and it's not the most exciting creatures to fight. It's mostly just people. There's like a single drake that she uses to eat the horses. There's this horrible little note where they're having to like replace their horses, their loyal cavalry horses, with the other kind of horses so they can better pretend to be the bandits. So they let them go a little bit at a time. But then, unbeknownst to the other forces, she sends this drake out and like to eat the horses. So that sucks for everyone involved. She's not a nice person. And then at the end of there, you find the correspondence to the commander that like the Earl hired her and set all that up. So once they have those 2 pieces of information, then they can go after the Earl, and that is its own map. So that's technically, it's listed in part 1, but that's still that this happens after part 2 and part 3, and it mentions that the Earl is actually can escape and flee and show up later in the campaign, or they can confront him at the inn. So that could be an interesting, I don't, you know, not having read the future adventure paths, I'm not sure where he fits into the plot very well. I do like being able to reuse villains, so that could be pretty neat if he's able to escape, but you know, you also want to give your players those options as much as you can if they actually do things really well and act quickly, if they can actually catch him and arrest him or even kill him. That could certainly happen. Part of the magic of role-playing is a DM, you really don't know what could end up happening. So the only weird thing is that the part 4 doesn't really tie into this main plot so much. It's just another thing you discover while you're in Yanmas, which is this cult that has risen up, which is claiming to have the returned, slain son of the Grand Prince, which is that Prince Carius, I think his name is, the younger brother of the woman you're working for, Princess Eutropia. So that's obviously a big deal. It doesn't have anything to do with your main plot other than like, oh, I guess we need to follow up on this because that seems like a pretty important thing. And the cult's actually pretty benign, but of course it's not because they never are. But I like that the scene and the location is really interesting. It's in this encircling bower, and you can see there's this neat theater set up here. And this really reminded me of the like Interview with a Vampire scene where they go to the theater of the vampire troops and they all act out this like grisly scene on stage and people are kind of freaking out. It's not that part doesn't really happen. It's just the child comes up and just says a bunch. It's almost like a religious sermon. Like it just says a bunch of nice stuff and everybody's like, oh, it's him. But I like physically, but the part of Interview with Vampires, they go underneath and then they find all the weird shit. But I love, if you recall, one of my chief complaints about previous maps that had these big social situations, they felt really empty on Roll20 because they didn't have tokens on the map. It was just the few like NPCs that were mentioned, but the story says, you know, there's 30 people here, 40 people here, whatever, and you just see that like, well, where are all the tokens at? Which gives me more work as a DM to be like, well, let me put at least some tokens on there and make it look like it's a crowded field, even if it's just a bunch of generic faces. And they do that here, and it looks great, doesn't it? Like, you've got all those now, granted, I don't like how Roll20 insists on having, when they don't have a picture, they just do the word. That doesn't look great, but I like that the tokens are here on the map, and this looks like an actual crowded, like, venue that people would attend. That part is awesome. I love that. It's appreciated. It works well. This map is really cool. It's interesting to have an actual like stage theater as a map. Obviously, they can go to the lower section here, which basically provides a mini dungeon where there's like a golem guardian. There's a dwarven alchemist who throws away her like shit to this black pudding down here, and she makes all the drugs and things that enthrall the prince. So turns out the twist here is that prince that they claim is actually the real deal. He is actually the resurrected return of the slain prince. And he is not an evil dude at all, but he is kind of under a lot of concoctions and magical enthrallments that make him basically just a puppet. He's being used as a political puppet by this cult because they've got the real deal, and they're like, well, shit, we can just ascend the power and do all that. It's a little bit like the plot line kind of dies here because you don't really know what the overall like purpose and plot here, and in the adventure even states like, and even this, who's the leader, this Van Vadrigan Pole, he's not even sure what he's going to end up doing. He just has this kid, and this is the avenue he sees as being successful, is having this cult of personality around him. So it becomes a rescue mission. Basically, you find out he's the real deal, and your character should hopefully want to actually rescue this person, who they hopefully don't see as a total abomination, and get him out of there. The problem is, your players probably already just dealt with the main villain of the story, which was that Earl, and now they just kind of go on what looks like just another tangent to do this rescue. So what the campaign does is it kind of throws a final boss fight at you in the form of this psychopomp called Zan. And Zan is supposed to show up at least once when they're running around the city in a disguise, and he's supposed to kind of tell them about the cult and his worry about it, and like maybe they should go investigate. And then he actually pops up. He's in this map up here on the upper level looking down, and your players can actually notice him with a pretty high perception check. So you're supposed to be able to see him and kind of tease him a little bit, but otherwise he just kind of shows up during this final battle as this like challenge rating 12 skeletal bird, just badass looking creature. Let's see if I can find the thing. What does he look like? There he is. He's cool as shit looking, and he's like this, he's like an arbiter of like the neutral god Pharasma, not to be confused with Gwendolyn Christie's character from the new Star Wars trilogy. But I think that's like the goddess of death, maybe. I don't know my Pathfinder lore like at all, so forgive me. But it seems cool. There's a shit ton of information about psychopomps and what they do, and the death and resurrection. All those supplemental rules I mentioned earlier involve this at the end. It just feels a little bit like they wrote the adventure and they realized, oh wait, we actually don't have like a good final epic boss fight because we're throwing this cult thing into them. And it should be, and I mentioned, the players can tackle these in any order, but it mentions that they should reach 9th level while investigating the cult, which tells me that the cult should be the final thing they do, whereas all the others can be technically in any order, and they're just supposed to level up to 8 at some point. Which means they are supposed to deal with the Earl and do all that political stuff first, and then deal with the cult last. I'm not sure. You'd have to like artificially gate that cult stuff later. Which the way I would do it is be like, hey, there's this cool scenario that happens with that bower, where basically it's this ceremony the players are supposed to like sit in and watch, and as the kid is introduced and all that. And I would have that be at a future date. And then the players have to go, and just that would be a nice way of suggesting the players, go do all the other adventures first, and then like, oh, happens to be you've taken down the Earl, and the next day is going to be the cult service, that kind of a thing. But the problem is if they do the cult last, again, that leaves them without a, they do like kind of a boss battle, because the leader of the cult, I guess, could be one, and they rescue him, and then they come out, and then they just fight this big, beefy boss fight kind of at the entrance to the city. Is this like, that king's an abomination, you should give it to me, and if you don't, I'm going to kill you. It just kind of, I don't know, it doesn't feel great. But I think a clever DM could do cool things with it, especially if you use Zahn in cool ways, even more ways than what you would do here. If you actually use this thing throughout the adventure, have it be like following the players around, or noting its progress, or like, meeting, like having that at least one meeting with him for sure. So it doesn't just literally show up out of the blue. But again, I love that there's a map here. Like, it's such a small bullshit map, frankly, but it's here and it's great and it works perfectly, right? Like, it's granted he can meet him anywhere, but that works if they're going out of the city. It's the bam, and they didn't have to do that. Roll20 didn't have to include like hardly any of these little miniature maps on here, but they did, and I love it. It works amazingly well to have all these maps. That makes it so much easier for the DM, and like all those concerns I have about like non-linearity and that kind of thing, that's just stuff that you can fix in writing. Like, you can deal with all that for writing, and that's awesome, because the more maps and the more work that's done for me is less I have to spend doing that, and more work I can spend doing the writing part and making this a really cool, well thought out, organized, fun adventure, and that's awesome. All right, let's go into pros and cons. Let's go to a better. Which we look at all. I think we looked at pretty much all these maps, didn't we? All right, let's leave it on Yanmos then. All right, so pros and cons for the Twilight Child. Pro, there are tons of quality, diverse maps for all the various important locations and events in Yanmos. Obviously, that is my number one pro here. I was just I'm speechless. I was super impressed with the amount of maps here, because especially in these adventure paths, they have been very light on the maps. It's been like 2, 3, or 4 maps. So I was amazed that they actually got maps for all these locations. That's fantastic. Pro, the Slaughterhouse map is particularly really cool looking, just visually and distinctly. It's got its decrepit, blood-stained design. It's a really, really neat looking map, and it really drives home that horror theme, which is used well. Pro, the adventure has a familiar structure to video game RPGs, wherein the PCs gather a bunch of quests at one time, then go around and just check them off one by one, giving DMs a solid framework to work with. Again, I like the way that's how I prefer to do open world adventuring, is give the players distinct, specific options to tackle in a confined location, to where I can prep stuff beforehand and have that ready to go, and feel like I've got enough of a jump start, even if they're given the freedom to kind of tackle what they want to. And finally, the pro, it just provides a good balance of giving the PCs options on where to go and what to do, pretty much as I just mentioned, keeping them within a single major location. Cons, I kind of had to reach a bit for cons, because I really did love this module particularly, but it does lack a single big meaty dungeon crawl. If you noticed, all those maps were kind of small, even though some of them are packed full of NPCs and creatures to where there's a lot of fighting, but they're physically tiny. And not just, I mean, they're, 5-foot grid maps are good, but it's just, you don't have those big, long, like in the first, in the Crownfall adventure, you had that second level dungeon where they fell through under the Senate and they had to go their way, and it was a really big, like, you had to scroll through, and it was a good sized dungeon. The second one really lacked any kind of dungeon, and it was more, but that's because it was out in the country and you're going around, solving little odd jobs. And this one has dungeons, but they're all kind of small, so it's not necessarily quality over quantity, because I think the quantity here is high quality, but I am jonesing for a nice big dungeon crawl, and I am hoping that the next module has one, because if not, we're going to be really starting to lack in a nice big dungeon crawl. And the campaign doesn't have to be all about dungeon crawls, certainly not, and I like the political angle on it, but I could use a nice meaty dungeon crawl. The other con, as I mentioned, the non-linear story can make for kind of an anticlimactic ending, which leading to a sudden boss fight that feels a bit cheap, just a little bit. I think you can weave it together well enough to make it work, but you might have to like artificially gate things and kind of work things around in order to make the more open-ended nature work a little better. But otherwise, there's really, really good stuff here, and I like Twilight Child a lot. So my final verdict, with lots of high-quality maps in a city brimming with mystery, danger, and blood, the Twilight Child is the strongest entry in the War for the Crown yet. So thank you everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.